What separates a weapon from a god? In Westeros, the answer is wingspan. We're ranking every major Targaryen dragon by their true size at death. From Balerion's world-ending 525-foot wingspan down to the pathetic 25-foot runt that marked the dynasty's collapse. These are the measurements that determined battles, shaped kingdoms, and decided who lived to see tomorrow. Some of these numbers will shock you. The dragon you thought was massive, turns out it was average. The one you thought was small, it could swallow horses whole. This is the definitive hierarchy of fire and blood. Let's begin with the titans that made armies surrender without a single sword drawn. Number 1. Balerion the Black Dread, 525 feet. Age at death, 207 years. Died 94 AC. Balerion is the benchmark. Every other dragon gets measured against him because he's not just the largest. He's the proof that nature itself took sides in Aegon's conquest. 525 feet of living siege, engine, teeth as long as swords, jaws that could swallow mammoths whole. When Balerion flew over Harrenhal, the castle's towers melted like wax. Not burned, melted. That's the difference between a dragon and the Black Dread. He didn't win battles, he ended arguments. Entire armies surrendered the moment his shadow swallowed them. His death in 94 AC closed a chapter of history. No dragon after him truly replaced what the realm lost. Balerion was inevitability with wings. Number 2, Meraxes, 410 feet. Age at death, 97 to 123 years. Died 10 AC, the Forgotten Giant. Meraxes was Rhaenys Targaryen's mount during the conquest, with a wingspan stretching 410 feet, nearly as massive as Balerion himself. She could swallow horses whole, turn castle walls to rubble, and her fire scorched the earth for generations. But here's what makes Meraxes unforgettable. She proved dragons aren't invincible. One scorpion bolt through the eye in dawn, and one of the 3 greatest dragons in history crashed to earth. That single moment rewrote every tactical manual in Westeros. Meraxes is the cautionary tale stamped into every Targaryen war plan. If Balerion is inevitability, Meraxes is risk, the reminder that the sky can betray you when you least expect it. Number 3, Vhagar, 479 feet. Age at death, 181 years. Died 130 AC. By the Dance of the Dragons, Vhagar had become the old war goddess. 181 years of accumulated scars, experience, and terror. Her 479-foot wingspan made her nearly equal to Balerion during the conquest. When she roared, the foundations of Storm's End shook. Vhagar was both weapon and political asset. Whoever held her could force rivals to treat negotiations like surrender talks. She wasn't just huge, she was experienced. And in dragon-on-dragon combat, that experience was lethal. When Aemond claimed her, the dance stopped being about succession and became about survival. Vhagar's death at the God's Eye felt like the realm itself, finally exhaling after holding its breath through 2 centuries of terror. Number 4, Vermithor, 440 feet. Age at death, 96 years. Died 130 AC. The Bronze Fury lived in the shadow of Balerion and Vhagar, but make no mistake, at 440 feet, Vermithor was a castle killer. King Jaehaerys's mount, bronze scales gleaming like beaten metal. This dragon towered over almost everything else that flew. What made Vermithor special was his political weight. A dragon this large doesn't just win fights, it changes coalitions. During the dance, he was claimed by Hugh Hammer, and suddenly the war had another apex predator in play. At the Second Battle of Tumbleton, Vermithor killed both Seasmoke and Tessarion before dying from his wounds. His death was another step toward the dynasty's power, shrinking into memory. Number 5, Silverwing, 476 feet. Age at death unknown. Survived the dance. Good Queen Alysanne's gentle giant. At 476 feet, Silverwing was nearly as large as Vhagar, yet she carried a completely different reputation. She refused to fly beyond the wall. when Alysanne tried, as if the dragon sensed something humans couldn't. What makes Silverwing haunting is that she survived the dance and fled to the Reach, living wild for years. She represented the "what if the dragons stayed" possibility, the timeline where the Targaryens might have rebuilt their dominance. But surviving a war like the dance doesn't guarantee stability. It just means the world is emptier around you. Silverwing is the realm's lost future, flying off into silence with no one left to call her home. Number 6. The Cannibal, 535 feet. Age at death, unknown. Vanished post-dance. The nightmare wild dragon. Coal black with green eyes, the Cannibal earned his name by feasting on dragon eggs and hatchlings. At an estimated 535 feet, he was the largest wild dragon, and the fact that he was wild made him even more terrifying. The Cannibal represents a rule of nature even dragons fear. He was never ridden, never tamed, never recruited into anyone's war. He was refusal incarnate, a force nobody could account for. When he vanished after the dance, it was almost worse than dying. Somewhere out there, a dragon-shaped hole exists in the records, and nobody knows if it's still breathing fire. Number 7. Dreamfyre, 486 feet. Age at death, unknown. Died 130 AC. One of the oldest she-dragons during the dance, pale blue with silver markings. At 486 feet, Dreamfyre was massive, experienced, and deeply tied to the dynasty's continuity. She'd laid multiple clutches of eggs over her long life, possibly including the eggs that became Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. What makes Dreamfyre's story tragic is that she survived long enough to become a true adult power, then died during the storming of the Dragon Pit, torn apart by a mob in the realm's ugliest collapse. Her legacy is that the Dragon Pit became synonymous with failure and desperate violence. Dreamfyre's end feeds the argument that dragons were never meant to be caged by frightened people. Number 8. Sheepstealer, 427 feet. Age at death unknown. Survived the dance. The wild brown dragon who got his name raiding flocks across Dragonstone. At 427 feet, Sheepstealer was big enough to be terrifying but wild enough to vanish when needed. During the dance, he was claimed by Nettles, and the two survived by being practical, hungry, and impossible to catch. Sheepstealer sits between big enough to kill you and wild enough to disappear, meaning he never became predictable like court dragons. That unpredictability made him feel older and wiser than he probably was. After the war, he kept the myth alive, the idea that dragons might still be out there, outside anyone's control. Sheepstealer is the lingering threat beyond the map's edge. Number 9. Seasmoke, 190 feet. Age at death unknown. Died 130 AC. Lenore Valarion's pale silver dragon, later ridden by Adam of Hull. At 190 feet, Seasmoke was a classic mid-sized war dragon, serious threat, but not so huge that the entire war revolved around him. What makes him special is that he sits in those combined size comparisons commanders whispered about. When you're calculating whether to engage 3 dragons, Seasmoke is part of that terrifying math. He died at the Second Battle of Tumbleton when Vermithor tore his head off. The dance didn't just kill claimants. It burned through assets that could never be replaced. Seasmoke is one more tally mark in that wasteful ledger. Number 10. Meleys, 328 feet. Age at death unknown. Died 129 AC. The Red Queen. At 328 feet with crimson scales flecked with pink, Meleys was famous for her incredible speed. Princess Rhaenys rode her at Rook's Rest, where Meleys fought both Vhagar and Sunfyre simultaneously. Even facing 2 dragons, Meleys nearly killed Sunfyre and delivered serious wounds to Vhagar before being overwhelmed. Imagine being so fast that ancient Vhagar struggled to land a killing blow. That was Meleys. Her legacy is that she proved courage and positioning can matter even in a war defined by size. Meleys made the dance feel like tactics, not just fate. When she fell, It felt like competence dying to chaos. Number 11. Sunfyre. 184 feet. Age at death unknown. Died. 130 AC. Sunfyre the Golden, the most beautiful dragon ever to live. At 184 feet, with golden scales and pink wing membranes, he was absolutely magnificent. But beauty is a curse in war. What makes Sunfyre special is that he was described as huge and heavy despite his youth, implying he was destined to become one of the greats if time allowed. At Rook's Rest, he survived horrific injuries, killed Grey Ghost later, and kept fighting even as his body failed. His legacy is that he became inseparable from the dance's brutality. Sunfyre represents the cost of pride, a dragon whose suffering became part of the war's darkest myth. Number 12. Grey Ghost. 217 feet. Age at death unknown. Died 130 AC. The pale grey-white wild dragon, remembered for being elusive rather than dominant. At 217 feet, Grey Ghost was formidable, but he tried to survive by avoiding attention, refusing to be owned or recruited into war. In a world of banners and claims, Grey Ghost represented refusal, the power of not being found. That makes his death feel especially unfair because he never asked to participate. His legacy is that the dance consumed even the dragons who wanted nothing to do with it. Grey Ghost's end makes the war feel like wildfire, not a duel, spreading until nothing is left untouched. Number 13. Caraxes. 262 feet. Age at death, over 59 years. Died 130 AC. The Bloodwyrm. Demon Targaryen's serpentine nightmare. Lean, long, and absolutely vicious. At 262 feet, Caraxes was roughly half Vhagar's size, yet he killed her anyway. What makes Caraxes legendary isn't bulk, it's ferocity. At the god's eye, he locked his teeth around Vhagar's throat and tore it out while his own belly was ripped open. He crawled onto shore with his entrails dragging before dying. Caraxes proved that dragon-on-dragon combat isn't solved by size alone, especially when the rider is willing to gamble everything. He's remembered as the dragon that made the dance feel personal, rage, and will-beating inevitability. Number 14. Syrax. 194 feet. Age at death unknown. Died 130 AC. Rhaenyra's golden she-dragon. At 194 feet, Syrax was formidable but pampered. She spent most of her life in the dragon pit, never seeing real combat until the dance erupted. What makes her tragic is the gap between prestige and strength. People confused her status with battlefield prowess, and that gap is where bad decisions happen. Syrax was a symbol of legitimacy, but symbols burn, just like everything else. When she died during the storming of the dragon pit, it reinforced how quickly the realm's awe turns to hatred once fear takes over. Syrax's end felt like the people declaring war on the very idea of dragons. Number 15. Vermax. 315 feet. Age at death unknown. Died 130 AC. At 315 feet, Vermax was young but operational. Dangerous bracket to be in because young dragons are still growing, but already being used as weapons. He died at the Battle of the Gullet, overwhelmed by scorpion bolts and crossbow fire while defending the Balerion fleet. Vermax represented the next generation coming online, the future the war couldn't wait to steal. His legacy is the reminder that dynasties burn their heirs first, and their dragons with them. Vermax never got to mature into what he could have been. Number 16. Tessarion. 394 feet. Age at death, over 10 years. Died 130 AC. The Blue Queen. At 120 feet. Cobalt blue with copper markings. Tessarion was young, but battle-tested. Prince Daeron's mount fought at the Second Battle of Tumbleton against Vermithor and Seasmoke. She sat in that sweet spot where she was still fast and aggressive, but big enough to kill. In Dragon War, that combination is lethal. Youth meeting experience with fire between them. Tessarion proved the dance wasn't just old giants stomping each other. It was a full ecosystem of dragons colliding, consuming everything in reach. Number 17, Tyraxes, 118 feet. Age at death, 10 to 13 years. Died, 130 AC, the picture of almost ready. At 118 feet, Caraxes was old enough to be present, but young enough that his loss feels like stolen investment. He lived in that transition between kid's dragon and real battlefield terror. He died in the dragon pit, part of the massacre that turned the pit into a symbol of wasted potential. War's love interrupting the moment when the next generation comes online. Teraxes is part of the indictment. The realm doesn't just lose power in the dance, it loses growth, the ability to ever recover what it once had. Number 18, Mourning, 295 feet. Age at death, 5 to 23 years, last known. 136 to 153 AC, the post-war Hope Dragon. At 295 feet, Mourning arrived when the story was running out of dragons, making her disproportionately symbolic. Every flap of her wings felt like the dynasty trying to breathe again. What makes her bittersweet is that even with Mourning alive, the world still trended toward fewer, smaller dragons. She represented rebuilding, but it was hope with a clock ticking somewhere off-screen. Mourning is what remains when the war ends. Not triumphant power, but fragile possibility that might not survive the next generation. Number 19, Quicksilver, 256 feet. Age at death, 36 years. Died, 43 AC. The tragedy of not big enough yet. At 256 feet, Quicksilver was a dragon asked to do what he wasn't ready for. Prince Aegon rode him against Balerion at the battle beneath the God's Eye, and it went exactly as you'd expect. Quicksilver is explicitly framed as far smaller than the true Titans, which makes his fights read like a speedboat crashing into a battleship. He was brave in a world that rewards size. His legacy is the lesson that bloodline and courage don't substitute for mass. Dragon wars aren't fair, and Quicksilver is remembered because he proved it. Number 20, Moondancer, 118 feet. Died, 130 AC. The scrappy fighter. At just 118 feet, Baela Targaryen's pale green she-dragon fought Sunfyre, who was more than twice her size, and still managed to maim both the dragon and King Aegon II. What makes Moondancer special is that she creates one of the sharpest size versus will moments in dragon warfare. She was explicitly smaller, yet she stepped into that fight like she belonged. Her legacy is defiance with wings. Moondancer became a fan favorite precisely because she argued that courage, tactics, and guts matter more than raw stats. 21. Morghul, 120 feet. Age at death, 6 to 7 years. Died, 130 AC. One of the Dragon Pit's young dragons. At 446 feet, Morghul's life was shaped by confinement, human fear, and politics rather than open skies. He represented what happens when dragons become property first and creatures second. The pit is where the relationship between people and dragons broke down completely. Morghul's death was part of that rupture. One more tally mark in the argument that dragons don't thrive when treated like trophies. His legacy is a warning label stamped onto the pit's stones. This is what happens when you cage fire. Number 22, Shrykos, 112 feet. Age at death, 6 to 7 years. Died, 130 AC. Like Morghul, Shrykos was young enough that her story feels like a life interrupted before it began. At 112 feet, she existed in the most tragic dragon setting, a world where fear turned into mob violence. She was tied to dynasty continuity, the child-dragon pairing supposed to carry the family forward. When dragons like Shrykos die, the dynasty loses more than a weapon. it loses a bridge to tomorrow. Her legacy is inseparable from the Dragon Pit disaster. Shrykos embodies how quickly the realm's awe turns to cruelty once people feel powerless. She's the moment the spell breaks. Number 23. Stormcloud. 148 feet. Age at death, 9 to 10 years. Died, 130 AC. At 148 feet, Stormcloud was barely more than a juvenile. But he's remembered because he did something that mattered, carrying Aegon the Younger to safety during the Battle of the Gullet before dying from his wounds. What makes him special is that his youth is the point. The realm is so desperate, it sends children and young dragons into events that should be reserved for veterans. Stormcloud's role is the war admitting it has no safe options left. His legacy is that he becomes one of the clearest examples of the dance chewing up the innocent, not just the ambitious. Stormcloud is the cost paid by the next generation. Number 24. The Last Dragon. 25 feet. Age at death unknown. Died. 153 AC. Small, stunted, sad. At just 25 feet, the Last Dragon is important precisely because it's pathetic. This is the Empire's firepower reduced to a fragile leftover that could barely threaten a horse. The Targaryens began with world-ending beasts and ended with something that barely qualified as dangerous. The dragon's body became an autopsy report for the dynasty itself. Its legacy marks the end of an era in the most unglamorous way possible, which makes it hit harder. The Last Dragon isn't a blaze, it's an ember going cold in silence. Numbers 25 to 27. We have Drogon at 20 feet, Rhaegal at 18 feet, and Viserion at 17 feet. This is their measurements by the end of the published books, which puts them at just over 1 year old. At 300 AC, they are all currently still living. Daenerys' 3 dragons prove that extinction is never permanent. Fire just sleeps until the right chaos wakes it up. At 20, 18 and 17 feet respectively, they're barely bigger than horses. Yet they've already changed the world's balance of power. What makes them special is what they represent. The return of wildness into a world that thought it had domesticated magic. Even at this young age, Drogon is already difficult to control, echoing the ancient truth that dragons are never just pets. Their legacy, even by the end of the published books, is suspense. These are fuses that have been lit, but the explosion is still off-page. Once they grow, the world's rules change. The question isn't if, it is when. From Balerion's apocalyptic 525 feet down to the Last Dragon's pathetic 25, this is the complete hierarchy of fire and blood. But here's the truth the numbers can't capture. The smallest dragons often left the biggest scars. Quicksilver proved courage doesn't beat mass. Moondancer proved it sometimes does. Caraxes killed a giant twice his size. The Last Dragon proved that empires end not with a roar, but with a whimper. Size determines battles, but heart, timing, and tragedy, those write history. Which measurement shocked you most? Drop it in the comments and subscribe for more deep dive Targaryen content.